Meeting September 25th, 2024. Clerk, can you call the roll, please?
Mr. Rowling,
Here.
Ms. Casabon, Mr. Phillips, Ms. Tanner, Mr. Impastato, Ms. O'Brien, and Mr. Corbin. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Remember that only members of the Agenda Review Committee can make a motion, a second, and a vote at this meeting. Also, the review of the Parish Council agenda for the regular meeting for October 3rd, 2024. This agenda is always available at the council office and also on the website, which is STPG-TV.org. So the following items are currently have been pulled. Ordinances for introduction, and that is number 14, ordinances calendar number 7717. At this time, I would entertain if there's anyone on the committee or council that would like to pull anything additional. At this time, I do not see any. Also, does anyone from the administration would like to pull anything? We do not see any. So now, at this point, I do need a motion to refer the remaining of the agenda, minus the items that have been pulled, which we obviously don't have any extra, sorry about that,
Just that one final.
which is introduction number calendar 7717. At this time, if I could get a motion. I do have a motion, a second. We got a second. Members all say yay. Yay. Any nays? Okay, the yays have it. So at this time, let's see, bear with me.
You can read it if you want to.
Okay, number 14, ordinance calendar number 7717, the ordinance to amend the 2024 capital improvement budget and capital assess amendment number 34, the fishing pier facility capital projects. We need a motion and a second for this ordinance for introduction number 14 to the Finance Committee for discussion. Do you need a motion at this time? I do need a second. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, we're good at that. Okay, at this time, we're going to move on, and we do have a presentation. Mr. Clint, regarding the emergency operations, is he in the audience?
Yes, he's there.
Thank you, sir. And for the record, just your name and full name and title, please.
I can hear. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well, we're going to skip that. So, Clint Orey, I'm the Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. I was asked to present on our department. And so what I figured I would do with the very short amount of time that I have is just cover a three-step process that I like to use whenever I'm trying to understand something. And that is, what is the mission and the purpose of it? What are the laws, the rules, the national standards, or best practices around that? Because that provides the guardrails to keep you in line as you try to accomplish your mission and purpose, and can help avoid issues. And then the last is, what resources do you have available to accomplish it? And I think that this is helpful because it's kind of a unique, it definitely is a unique department in parish government. And so we'll start with the mission and purpose. And the good news is, simply stated, it's the same as it is for you and for everybody else in government. In the Declaration of Independence, it talks about the purpose of government: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's to that purpose government is instituted. And then in our state preamble to the Constitution, it specifically talks about the purpose of the Constitution and the governments that are under it in the state of Louisiana. And it talks about promoting the health, safety, and welfare of the public in part. And then President Cooper has in his, I believe it was his primary objectives for his administration, he kind of blends the two, actually. I really appreciate it. He says to provide for the health, safety, well-being, and quality of life of the citizens of St. Tammany Parish, and I love that. So all of us are really working towards the same thing. You would just simply add to the end of it, from all hazards, for emergency preparedness, and that's what our department does. And so I can read to you what our mission statement says, and you'll see it's pretty similar. It says to protect lives, property, and infrastructure from St. Tammany Parish, of St. Tammany Parish from all hazards through preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery. And so those kind of four components, sometimes they're worded in different ways. That's what we spend all of our time doing. Mitigate or prevent what we can. Preparedness, and that's where 95% of what we do occurs, and that includes coordination and building trust and relationships with all the many entities that we have to interact with in order to accomplish the mission. And then there's the event and the response and then the recovery. And so that's the mission, right? The next thing would be, what are the rules or the laws or the standards and best practices that we operate under? Well, overarchingly, as a nation, we have something called the National Preparedness Goal, and I can read you exactly what that is. It says, a secure and resilient nation with the capabilities required across the whole community to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk. And so I had said earlier that you could add from all hazards to the end of the purpose, and that would kind of cover our mission and purpose. You notice they use the same terminology there, from all hazards, but then it says that pose the greatest risk. And so our job is to identify what are the likely hazards and threats that face St. Tammany Parish, and then what are the expected risks that are most likely to happen, and then to mitigate, plan for, prepare for, and respond to those risks. And so the way that in the state of Louisiana, along with the National Preparedness Goal, is a mandate for all states to be prepared. And for each state, each county or parish, each municipality, down to the individual citizen. That is the National Preparedness Goal. And so that's what we're working to do continuously. The way that the state operationalizes that mandate is found in the Louisiana Disaster Act, and that is in state law. It's in Title 29. It's 721 through 739. If you ever have trouble sleeping, you could print that out and read it, and it puts you straight to bed. But in there, it contains everything there is that you could possibly want to know about responding to, recovering from disasters, being prepared, and most importantly, it spells out, because part of along with the National Preparedness Goal is the National Response Framework, and it's how we're expected to respond. And it should be scalable. There should be a clear line of authority, and it should be in an organized fashion. And so the state creating these laws was their way of doing that. And it clearly states that the governor is the commander-in-chief in a disaster at the state level, and that at the local level, it is the parish president or police jury president, depending on the type of or form of government that you have. And so it outlines the responsibility and authority of them as such, and then it states that they shall have a director of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, both the governor and the parish president, and that they shall have an office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. And it outlines the responsibilities and authority of those directors and of those offices. And so it establishes that line of authority all the way up from the president down. And so one of the things that's sort of unique about my position is I'm not just the Director of Homeland Security for St. Tammany Parish government. I am the Director of Homeland Security for St. Tammany Parish. It's everybody, every single person, every entity in the parish. And that's an important thing to understand. And so along with all the other things I just mentioned, it covers things like shelters and evacuations and curfews and how to get aid and everything you could possibly imagine, all things as it relates to disaster response, emergency response, including limitations on liability. It provides those immunity, that immunity to everyone, literally everyone that's responding, absence of gross negligence. All that's in that law, and so it's important to understand that. So again, that's the laws, the rules. As far as industry standards and best practices, it's FEMA, because in that national preparedness goal and in that national response framework, there are many acts and presidential directives and other laws federally that establish what all of those things are and mandate them, and then FEMA sort of is responsible for producing them and sort of operationalizing how all this will work. And so that is our standard. That every industry has one, right? Ours, it falls under FEMA. So that's the rules, that's the framework in which we operate, that's the laws and best practices. And so the last thing was, what resources do we have? And so this is the part that is so unique about this job and makes it, I think, possibly the hardest job there is, because I have nothing really. What I do have in the law is some authority, but I think all of us know up here, if you just go around to people and say, hey, you do this, you do this, you do this, that's not going to go real well, and especially in an emergency. And so that's why I was describing that in that preparedness piece, where there's the coordination and the cooperation and the planning and the preparedness, that's where all the magic happens. By building relationships, building cooperation, building trust, understanding of what can be done and what can't be done and why we would ask for something and when and where. All of that ahead of time before the disaster happens is what makes it go so much smoother when it does. And so that literally is what I spend seemingly 7 days a week, sometimes feels like 24 hours a day doing, is trying to build those relationships and that capacity. And you know, that's where we will find the best results, is by all working together. There's not anything that I personally can do, really. There's small things, I guess, but the biggest thing is getting everyone to work together and to cooperate when the time comes. And as you all know, as elected officials with that responsibility for the parish, you know how difficult that is. And so I will say that I have been overwhelmed by the amount of support that we get from all of those various agencies that we have to work with. It has really been amazing, and I really appreciate it. And so, and including all of you in our administration that supports what we do. So I don't know if there's any questions about any of that. I'm sorry I didn't pull up my computer is very, very secure. I can't get in it. So, it was basically what I just told you. There's a couple pictures in there. So I don't know if there's anything else any questions I can answer before I go.
We do have some questions real quick. I'll just have my question. First off, we appreciate everything you do. I know a couple of weeks ago at the command center, y'all did a great job there. Your employees do a wonderful job also. I do have a question about FEMA really quick. How the communication with FEMA, do you have like quarterly meetings with them or like twice a year or something like that? What does that look like? Because I mean, we are in that coastal region still.
So I think it's important to understand when I was talking about scalable and a clear line of authority. So everything that we do as a parish is through the state. We do sometimes meet with FEMA officials, but the state is our spokespeople. They're our representatives to FEMA. And so really, I spend a lot of time building relationships and understanding and explaining, our circumstances here in St. Tammany Parish. That GOSEP is where the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness is where we do that, and they are our direct line to FEMA, and that's how it's set up, right? So the way we get to FEMA, yes, we can go around, but generally that's not the best way to do it. And so most of our time is spent with the state, because the state is our lead in dealing with FEMA. And we're in FEMA Region 6, we're in GOSEP Region 9, but we have very good leaders, and there's a lot of people. They're centered in Texas, and I cannot think of the gentleman's name that is the lead for that FEMA Region 6 there in Texas, but there's a lot of employees that work for them that were recruited from Louisiana, so we're very well represented through FEMA. And we do get to see them and get in front of them a couple times a year, but it's mostly GOSEP.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, we do have quite a few that have some questions or comment. Mr. Kugel first.
Clint, thank you. You know, you guys always have been doing a great job, you know, since I've been here. One of the questions this is a little bit more public works, but maybe you can still explain the authorities. One of the things that came up recently with, I think, the tornado was what relief can the parish offer to gated communities? And that with debris pickup, when that's more public works, but still, what are the limitations? And because I understand some of that is FEMA related as well. What are the limitations for gated and private communities?
So basically, it's really not a FEMA thing. It's a government thing, and it goes back to the state constitution. We can't go onto private property and use public funds and resources to take care of private property. And so when you choose to be a gated community, you're choosing to, you know, there's certainly some value, I guess, in that, in privacy and being in control of what you do, but you're giving up some of those services that you would have had otherwise. It's a tough situation. And so I know I've heard of in the past, and this part of it's new to me, really. Sometimes they have to apply themselves, and John could probably speak better to that for assistance, or possibly Natalie. But yeah, that's a state constitution thing. Our hands are tied as government going on private property and doing work. We can't do that.
Okay, thank you.
that
We
answers
do have, anything else, Mr. Kugel? You good? Ms. O'Brien?
Yes, thank you for the excellent job you do. I'm so glad you have that position.
Thank
But you and I have had conversation about vulnerable populations previously. And I do still have heartburn every time we have a storm coming this way, because I know while seniors who are in nursing homes will have assistance, those who are borderline, who are still at assisted livings, and seniors who are not in any of those types of facilities oftentimes are without help. Right. I know we cannot be all things to all people. I totally understand that. Does it look like there's anything on the horizon that will enable us to give some additional assistance to those vulnerable populations, people who worked hard, paid their taxes all their lives, and in many cases have family that's now living out of state because of the economic conditions in Louisiana? So they're in a situation that they did not anticipate having. So, and I don't know if anybody has any idea about how to address this, but this is a very, very real need and concern for our community.
Yeah, so just so you'll know, I literally lose sleep at night, and I'm not joking. I literally lose sleep at night over that. But again, we can't spend money we don't have. The one thing we could have possibly steered money towards got voted down, which was the health millage. There is a need, there's no question, but there is very, very limited resources. And so what I have turned my attention to doing after talking to anybody who would listen to me is to try and focus on what can be done, one, through educating them on what they can do to have a plan to get out. Because there's really no good place to be in St. Tammany Parish if we're in the path of a major hurricane. There just isn't. And so any shelter that we could open would be a school, which that's not a good place for the type of people you're talking about to be at, in a gym, and then have to move from a gym to a hallway during the heart of the storm, because it's not safe to be in the gym. Those aren't hardened buildings, right. And many of them can flood, even those well north of I-12 and I-10. And so all that has to be taken into consideration. And so the best thing is for them to evacuate. And we go to nursing homes, we go to assisted living facilities, we go to apartment complexes that focus on seniors and have meetings for those groups with Coast and others, and try to make them understand that the best thing for you to do is have a plan. We even created a resource. It's on our website under the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. That is an evacuation planning tool. We're having our own disaster outside right now. You can hear it's hailing.
Well, I know.
The good news is it's supposed to pass quickly. Anyway, it is a huge issue. I'm working with Habitat East right now on some possible grants for resilience hubs, what that will look like and where they could even be located. And, you know, the biggest issue we have is St. Tammany Parish is 845 square miles of land. It's almost double the size of Baton Rouge and more than double the size of the other 3 or 4 parishes that are, you know, of our population size. It's spread out. And so how would you even get them to the right place? There's a lot of challenges, and, you know, I just continue to try and plug away as best I can. If there was funding for that and the resources became available, you know, you could do something with it, but that would take, as you know, a miracle in a sense. I don't see that happening.
Well, I was going to say, when I was RSVP director with Volunteers of America, I used to do meetings at different facilities with somebody from the Sheriff's Department and the Red Cross. You might want to talk to them about assisting and getting the word out, because we had a lot of those meetings for seniors. So that's an option to get the word out for evacuation.
We're
some
on
extra
the road a lot
meetings.
doing those meetings, just so
Right.
you know. That's still happening.
Okay.
But yeah, we do, but, you know, you do the best you can to get the word out.
Okay, sounds good.
All righty. You didn't miss a beat with this weather, by the way.
Yeah,
You were
man.
talking, I can tell you. We're having our own storm right now. Mr. Corbin?
Yeah, hey, Clint, I got a couple of quick questions and comments. I am very impressed with the special effects. So if funding's required for the EOC, please let us know, because you brought this in just on cue.
Right.
Anyway, I want to thank you, obviously, for your service and the service of your team. But the question is more germane to, we just had a Category 1 go through, team mobilized, everybody did a lot of work. Were there any lessons learned, specific lessons learned or opportunities for improvement that resulted from that? You know, as an example, I asked in my district for people to watch, take pictures, send me things of flooding areas that we may not have noticed because it's only a Category 1. Did you guys have anything in that mobilization, execution, and close down that, and I'm not talking about a long list, but maybe 1 or 2 or 3 lessons learned or opportunities for improvement that you realized out of that?
Yeah, so that's a big part of what we do, whether it's an exercise, a training class, or whether it's an actual event. We always sit down immediately, our smaller team, 5 of us, and do a hot wash, and take notes. And then right now, I probably would have been sending it out today, but I'm here right now. We created 2 surveys that we want to send out to, 2 different ones. One is for those that were actually activated in the EOC, and one for those that were active but outside of the EOC, so like parish council members and others, to kind of get your input and feedback. But we actually have a pretty good list of things, from small things like, you know, we ended up shrinking the size of the number of people we brought in, more than we have before, but less than a full activation, and so that meant we had to make some other changes last minute, and so some things slipped through the cracks. We had the way we would normally check those people in got disrupted because we had a failure with the badge system, and so that then snowballed into people not knowing where their assignments were for their rooms. You know, and while you're working, it's fine, but when you're not, you want to know what room do I go into? It's something as small as that, to even how we handled feeding all of the workers that were out there working during the storm. There's a laundry list of things, and there's specific things, even how our crisis team operated, that some changes we've talked about making, and some meetings already in the works being scheduled to try and hone that and improve that. every time you do anything, there's an opportunity to learn from it and to improve. And I'm all about continuous improvement and trying to measure that any way I can. Unfortunately, because of the nature of our work, rarely is it consistently the same, and it's pretty rare that you get an opportunity to collect data. And there hasn't been any collected in the past, so I'm starting from scratch. But no, I appreciate that question, and absolutely, we are jumping on that.
Okay. Thanks, Clint.
You're welcome.
Okay, Mr. Kugel.
I had another Maureen made a point about the vulnerable populations. So in my district in Pearl River, which is actually town limits, you have the community center, and every day around 10:30 to 11, a lot of seniors go there for meals. I think it's through Coast.
It is.
It's through Coast.
Yep.
So when you have these situations where a natural disaster occurs, they can't get there. What is the SOP or the standard operating procedure in that situation?
So I don't have a good one. I'm just going to be honest with you. I have to, based on the situation, because the only public transportation we have is Coast or Star, which the parish operates, but we have a contract with Coast, and so we have limited use of that, except for in an immediate emergency. The way Coast and Star works is you sign up for that, and it's scheduled in advance. It's like they don't run a route. There's not like a stop you would go to. You sign up, you're scheduled, you're on a route to be picked up at your house. And so I don't have a good way. I'm counting on first responders to let me know where that need is, and then it might be me driving a Coast van. It could be somebody from Public Works. And I know who to call and what to do, but until some of that kind of gets better figured out, I'm just being honest, I can't even make a plan. The plan is I'm going to have to adjust based on the circumstances and the situation. I have the National Guard on speed dial, and they normally have to be activated, but there's a small number that I know I can get here within an hour. And I can just pick up the phone and call directly, and then we can worry about putting it in a web EOC. I have workarounds, but that's what they are. It's nothing that's solid and like, hey, we can do it this way. It's just, and I've tried, believe me, from the day I walked in. That was like one of my biggest goals, because I was on the other side rescuing people and didn't have any place to put them or bring them my whole career. And so I was like, I'm going to come in and I'm going to figure that out, and I still haven't. So, but I haven't given up, I can assure you. And I talk to anybody and everybody that I can about that.
And so one of the things, like as Jeff mentioned with lessons learned, so with the tornado a few months ago, there was I think at first there was like on the east side of the parish, there was like 2 waypoints, and then eventually it switched to Creekside.
Right.
But I did notice when I went out there, because not a lot of people used it, and that could be a good thing, because maybe they had enough support at home.
Right.
How is that decisions made? And
so I knew that the potential for tornadoes was here. Where they would hit, I didn't know. There was a slightly higher risk of it happening as you got further east, but it could have happened anywhere in St. Tammany Parish. And so I had a few locations, including this one. I called Arthur and asked if I could use this building to bring people if I had to, as well as the community center in Mandeville, as well as I think the rec district in Pearl River,
Rec 7.
Because school was going to be closed, but they wanted to open the next day. And so I really couldn't put people in schools and then kick them out and have to move. So I didn't know it would be, and there was no way of us knowing just how bad we would get hit by 4 tornadoes, that it would be what it was, and that it would just so happen to hit a couple of apartment complexes while it was at it. But we had some semi-plans in place, and the city knew that. I communicated that to the fire department and the police department, and they adjusted on the fly. We were going to potentially use the Towers building, but it was very close to where kind of ground zero was for one of the bigger tornadoes. So we shifted it to John Slidell Park, and they just said, hey, if you need to go, go. And then I had a phone call with Councilman Impastato and said, hey, can we please open Lacombs, or you might even call me. I don't remember which way it went, and called the director of that rec district and opened it up just to get started. And then we activated Red Cross, and I contacted the school and said, hey, look, based on the damage, you're not going to be opening tomorrow and possibly not the next day. Can we please use Creekside? Yeah, go ahead. So it took some time to transition to a more appropriate, because technically all the places I was using as temporary shelters, those aren't approved and signed off. So the fire marshal has to come out and give you a capacity and tell you whether you can do it. LDH has to come out and look at it and tell you whether you can do it. And so, and for Red Cross to run it, it has to have gone through that approval process, and they have to do it. So it's not, you can't just open one wherever you want. There's rules and laws that apply to it. And so the school was one that I already had approved, and which is why we shifted to the school. But you're right, we don't need shelters probably as often as we would open them. And usually we historically don't get a lot of people at those shelters. But we can't not open them. There's going to be times when we have to. We always say it's a shelter of last resort, and we'll announce when it's going to be open because it may not be safe. So for instance, Creekside could absolutely flood in the right type of storm. It would get storm surge, not just from river flooding and not just from rainfall, from storm surge that far up because it's close to the Pearl. It's the same way along the Tchefuncte. And so knowing that, depending on the path of the storm, if it was a hurricane, if it's taking a path that looks like it's going to push that kind of water, there's no way in the world you could open that as a shelter. It's just not safe. You're sending people to potentially go die. And so we cannot do that. The answer is you have to leave. You have to go outside of St. Tammany Parish. And look, at the end of the day, and I tell this to everybody, I would help anybody, give them the last nickel out of my pocket. But each one of us are responsible for ourselves. And to Maureen's point of a nursing homes aren't. They're in a nursing home because they can't take care of themselves, which is why they're mandated. If you are a free person with liberty in the United States of America, you're responsible for yourself. And we need that message to be the message. We need people to be aware, be prepared, use the tons of resources we have on our website and that are available to make a plan. We even have the train stations. You could evacuate to Atlanta for $60. And certainly closer for less. And so each one of us needs to be responsible to the degree that we can be. We also have bus routes and places, communities that are already pre-designated that are far enough north, and depending on the direction of the storm, it could be from east to west, that you could evacuate to where there's resources. And that's what people need to do. That's the safest thing to do.
Okay, I think we good. We appreciate all the good information. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Oh, yes, President Cooper. Sorry, I didn't see your light on.
On?
Yes.
Now you're on.
Thank you. You stay up there, Clint. Thank you. First, I want to say I like this opportunity for our directors to have a presentation every month before the Council Agenda Review Committee so that you have an idea directly from the director, and it also gives the public the opportunity to hear directly from my director, so I certainly appreciate it. With regard to Clint and the office that he directs, again, we were put to the test 2 weeks ago, and I know that they did an outstanding job with the circumstances that we had. Some may have said it was a trial run, but it wasn't a trial run. It was a hurricane. And we were expecting the worst, but prepared and hoping for the best. So I want to commend him, Assistant Director, Deputy Director Colin Semino, Vanessa, Amanda, and Robert, who make up his team, along with all the other stakeholders and partners that were a part of the activation at the EOC. As you know, Mary was embedded at the EOC on behalf of the Parish Council, and Amy Ebersabel was embedded on behalf of our legislators. And they're the points of contact that gets information out to their representatives. And as Clint said, he has a direct contact with GOSEP. We have met him as well. Jacques Thibodeau is the director of GOSEP. We've got him on speed dial. Jacques is very familiar with St. Tammany. He was very instrumental in the Slidell tornado and getting us assets and reimbursements and giving us the guidelines for reimbursements. So we feel comfortable in that we've got great contacts. Regarding FEMA, we do have direct contacts with FEMA, but that's mostly through the finance office in getting our reimbursements and such. So they're in constant communication with FEMA. as we receive our reimbursements. So, and again, at this point, we can be very fortunate in that we're not looking at Hurricane Helene coming to the coast of Louisiana and St. Tammany Parish. Otherwise, we would probably be at the Emergency Operations Center right now, getting ready for that big storm. And we certainly, our prayers go out to the folks in Florida and beyond that are going to feel the impacts of what is now Hurricane Helene. So getting back to Clint, thank you for what you do. We certainly appreciate you. And Team Tammany appreciate you too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, President Cooper. Thank you, sir. Next, we have Desire Line with Coastal Study Update. If you can just state your full name and your organization. Thank you for the record.
Thanks so much, y'all. Oh, can you hear me? Evelyn Campo with Desire Line. Okay, there we go. I'm just getting plugged in here, but thank you guys so much for having us. Before I jump into my presentation, I know we have some council people who have been very active in initiating this study. So I don't want to jump in ahead of you guys. You guys go ahead and you know, say any comments that you have on the topic, and then I'll dive right in.
Which study are we talking about?
Oh, sorry, the Coastal Resilience Study. So this was one that started kind of as a Bayou Liberty study and then expanded a little bit.
So when I thank y'all for coming, and special thanks to Ross and his department for putting us together. This started. This was one of the first things I did when I was elected in my previous term, because on the campaign trail, I represent, as most of y'all know, prior to this, I represented primarily Slidell and Lacombe, and we had some of the highest incidences of severe repetitive loss. And it just didn't make any sense to me that we had 300 incidences where we need to raise someone's house that was built on a slab. It didn't make any sense. Why are we continuing to build slab homes in my area? And at the time, before I got elected, there was a large builder who was trying to build 1,100 houses right across the street from my kid's school, below I-12. So I just thought, this is something we need to look at, and this is what we studied. So I started off with my moratorium, which led us into partnering with Desire Line. And then when Councilman Impastato got elected, he and I, being neighbors, we decided to go in this together. And Joe, if you want to say what some of the reasons were for y'all getting your district involved in the study.
Basically the same reasons you've all just stated. You just stated, you know, I mean, we know we have a major issue with homes built in low-lying areas that should be elevated, and we want to get data and information so we can make educated decisions and try to resolve some of these issues.
Okay.
So it evolved from the District 11 moratorium study to the District 7 and 11 to now the coastal resiliency, but it's still the same thing. Taking a hard look at everything below I-12 in our two areas.
Thanks so much, y'all. I think that really helps us set the stage here. We do have our presentation for you. We also have paper handouts of the slides. There we go. So thanks so much, y'all, for giving us context and for all of you guys joining this conversation. So just a little bit up top, as the council person stated, this was a study that was started in a very specific geographic area, so it's not a study of the whole parish. It is very specific to coastal resilience. We can see that, you know, the flood risk is one of the main driving factors in a lot of the issues that we'll be discussing today. That being said, you know, I know we are here all together as the council, but this is not something that is 100% squared away at this point. So I do just want to preface this with, you know, these are the recommendations that the parish is contemplating, but I would like to hear from all of you if these recommendations are appropriate or align with your approach to this topic, okay? Oh, and thank you so much. Yeah, I see y'all are getting your papers too, so you can see the same thing. All right, so you guys have already kicked us off with our welcome and introductions. Thank you. We're going to go through the study area, the purpose and goals, some of the initial findings and recommendations, and then our next steps. So here you can see the study area. A lot of this is south of I-12, right? So that's really where we're focusing in. You can see Lacombe, Bayou Liberty, and you can see the western edges near but not including Mandeville. So here's kind of our list of goals. We have some moratoria in the area that we're hoping that this study will actually address kind of the need for those moratoria. As the council people stated, you know, residents in the area have a lot of concern about the flood risk that they're seeing. They're seeing their flood risk is changing and increasing with each event. And it's like we're right on topic today, right, with our discussion about the EOC and having a little weather event here. We're right in line. The long-term goal of the study is really to support land development patterns that are resilient to flooding. So you don't want development that's going to make the problem worse. You want something, obviously, that people can be safe in for generations in terms of your housing stock. We also took a look at infrastructure constraints, concern about high-density developments that may potentially outpace the parish infrastructure. And this is also within the context of kind of a bunch of initiatives that the parish has going on, things like long-range studies and plans, the UDC update, the comprehensive plan, and the development of plans for drainage, transportation, and wetlands. So this is pretty simple. Here are some of our findings. Flood risk is a concern, right? That's what we all know starting this study, but we put some numbers to that as we looked further into the study area. Approximately 57% of the study area is in a flood zone. I would put to y'all, you guys are well familiar with your flood maps. They are many decades old, so that is an underestimation of the risk, and that's part of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with complex flooding sources here too, and so that complicates things a bit. We have kind of a low and kind of a flat topography in the area, but we're also, so we have coastal flood risk, but we also have a problem draining to the lake, right? So we have kind of that confluence of two different factors. And we have some very valuable wetlands and floodplains in the area that actually protect us when we have a hurricane. So here you can see some of our findings on land use and some of our figures on the existing conditions here. So most of the structures in the study area are single-family homes, but the concern here is largely focused on 18 large undeveloped parcels. What we've heard from residents and what we see in the science of analyzing this area is that if those undeveloped parcels end up very densely developed, we're going to shift our flood risk even more, right? And residents are going to see potentially even more frequent or more extreme flooding. 61% of the area is zoned residential, about 30% is zoned for public facilities. That is largely the wetlands in the area. I know public facilities can be kind of a confusing term, but they're overlaid on the wetlands. And then we're seeing increased demands for development, especially near the western edge of the study area. Jump right in, yes. Sure. Now, okay, I don't have the, Corps of Engineers definition right in front of me, but to the best of my memory, it's basically land that's saturated or has water for like most of the year, right? And so those wetlands are where you see a lot of the vegetation that actually cuts down on the wind force that a hurricane will bring. They also store a lot of water, so it's like there's so many reasons why we should value those wetlands. Thank you. Getting to the existing conditions in the study area, you all know this so well. I'm sure I don't have to tell you. Our drainage is really reliant on gravity and water that is already in the lake or on its way to the lake. And so that compounds a lot of the challenges that we see. We have tidal influences, we have storm surge to contend with, and then we also have drainage coming from the north to the south in the area. In addition to our drainage challenges, there are some natural challenges associated with sewer systems in a coastal area. When you have aging septic systems, again, y'all are very familiar with this issue, so I know you understand what I'm telling you. Some of those aging septic systems can break. They can contaminate the water. It's a problem that the parish has focused on for many years now and has done recently some projects on. So things like the ozone woods, sewer repair projects are good examples of addressing that. So now we're getting to what is in our toolbox for what we're going to do about these issues. So this is kind of where y'all might want to jump in if you're ready. Okay, so some of the things that we have as our tools in dealing with flood risk are zoning, which can be your lever to increase or reduce density. Right, so you can what we call like down zone an area, which means that each lot is required to be larger, which means that over many generations, hopefully you have fewer people in that area that might flood, right? And you guys understand that equation fully, but that's one of our big tools in our toolbox. We also want to try to protect the wetlands and the natural floodplains. What that means is basically less concrete, less paved area, and less buildings in the area where you want to store the water. Also pretty basic equation there. And then we have a future land use map in addition to our zoning map that gives us the future trajectory of development in the parish. And in some of the areas within the study area, it has us projected to have low or medium density residential. But those areas we're seeing are actually flooding repeatedly, as Councilman Laughlin brought up. So does it make sense for us to project into the future that they should remain low or medium density? Maybe they should remain conserved, or, people should eventually, make their way into a larger lot pattern where there are fewer homes that are repeatedly going to be at risk. So here's some more specifics on the tools in our toolbox that we have at our disposal. And this is, again, just to kind of put the feelers out, see how this group feels about each of these approaches. And I know y'all are familiar with probably most, if not all of these. So one of the, kind of most straightforward approaches in an area like this is reducing fill. When people bring in, many cubic yards of dirt, it really just takes up the space where the water wants to go, and it makes the water go higher, right? Like we always talk about the bathtub analogy, right? We always talk about displacing the water. That's what fill does. Especially in a coastal environment, people are really sensitive and really perceiving, the impact of fill on their property. They're looking at their neighbor's property and they see a bunch of dirt and they're like, well, I'm connecting the dots here. That's why the water might be higher. So that's a sensible approach, is to limit fill. Another one is to implement a higher freeboard standard for the buildings. That just simply means the buildings that are built new, so new construction, would have to be built 3 feet above, for example, your base flood elevation or your crown of the street in front of your house. Again, the higher a building is, I'm sure it seems obvious to y'all, the less likely it is to flood. Jump on in.
This gets back to a conversation we had.
It's up to you guys. Okay. Cool. Absolutely. We're getting close to the end, so you don't have to wait too long. Oh, perfect. Okay. So yeah, that freeboard standard, that gives you, y'all know that, just to kind of get into the science of it for a minute, your BFE, your base flood elevation, is statistically where the water is likely to be in that certain type of event. A lot of times you'll have an event that is statistically greater than the 100-year flood, in which case that number is not helpful because the water's going to be higher, right? Or it may be that, for example, we have kind of older maps. It may be that level where you're anticipating the water isn't right anymore because there have been a bunch of neighborhoods built since, 1989. And so now the real level where the water is going to be is up higher than you thought it was, right? So that's what freeboard is really supposed to address over time, keep people safer for longer. We're also looking at the implementation of design standards for open foundation construction. That means pier piling that is not an enclosed foundation with, for example, with backfill. So an open foundation, what that means basically, you can store more water under a house in a flood event if everyone has, you know, backfill and walls under their houses. The water has less space to go. And then also looking at some limitations on the outdoor storage of materials. I'm thinking specifically like hazardous materials or things that are not anchored, can float away in a flood, can crash into another person's house, right? We see this, unfortunately, much too often down here. So these are some of the building standards that we're proposing you could put into what we're calling an overlay zone. Again, I think y'all are very familiar with that from the UDC process, but just to reiterate what that is, you have your zoning district, say your residential district. You can have an overlay zone that doesn't tell you what uses you can have, but actually tells you how to build a little bit better. And you just put that on top of your residential district. And then one last recommendation that we found was the study area that we're looking at is largely built out or is at a high level of flood risk. So we still need somewhere for people to go, but the study area is not necessarily ideal for a lot of large-scale new development. So part of our recommendation is that we do need resilient housing in the parish, but we need to look at the best locations for it. And some of those locations are likely north of this study area. And so we're looking at the options for the parish to engage in programs that could help us house people, but get them a little bit more out of harm's way. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm listening, and I want to make sure that I'm Alex Carter with Desire Line. Evelyn and I work really closely on this with council members and with parish staff. That there's a lot of theories underpinning this that I think all of y'all can relate to, which is you have people who live in this area now and are experiencing a lot of flooding, right? Like that's what she's really talking about, all this different types of flooding and inundation. And they're really worried about future development that could make that flooding worse. And so what Evelyn's describing, you know, thinking about lowering densities, it's lowering fill that could potentially cause flooding to people who already live there. And so these are things to say, yes, we know you flood, we know you live there, we don't want future development to make it worse. So what are the tools that we can use? We're not saying you can't build south of I-12. We're saying if you're gonna build in this study area, you need to really build smart. You need to build stronger. You need to be not on a slab, right? And less homes is probably better because we don't want to put more people in harm's way. The infrastructure really isn't set up to handle a lot more cars, a lot more traffic, a lot more sewer. And so we're really trying to say, you know, this area is a strong area of the parish. It has a lot of character and community and fabric. We really have to protect that character. And to do that, we need to sort of say, if you're going to build here, build this way in these areas we know are high risk. And if you want to build more dense, we want to encourage you to go in an area that's higher and drier and has better infrastructure service and is less likely to flood in the long term. And I think y'all all kind of understand that these are all just very, you know, regulatory elements. And so Evelyn and I bounce these things off, and I'm listening to her and I'm like, I fully am appreciating it, but I want to make sure y'all know that behind this is a very long report that speaks to how we've engaged with the community, how we've worked with different civic organizations to develop these recommendations. And, you know, we're at the part of this study where we're sort of listing options, and we're going to be working with parish staff and the community to continue to refine it before we come back to y'all with final recommendations. We really just want to make sure you know this is kind of on the books and this is the direction that we're going. And if you don't have a specific instinct for one or another of these tools, that is totally okay. If there's something that you're like, I want to learn more about it, you can just let us know. We'll coordinate with parish staff to make sure you feel comfortable. And that's really what we want to do today, is we want to make sure you know this is going on, that you have an opportunity to say, I don't really understand this or that, or I want to learn more. And that before we come back in December, you have plenty of time to work through anything, so that we can, make sure we align with the moratorium's, expiration, and that we, work with the community. We're continuing to message, this project and what it's intending to do consistent with y'all's intentions.
There is a lot of science in there. That is absolutely true. I'm so glad that you mentioned that because, yeah, it is. There's a lot of research. You can't just tell someone you have flood risk. People need to see the data quantified. Even though, people can perceive it, they can see it when it rains. We need to, justify every move, of course. So this just gets to kind of the remaining timeline here in this study. As Alex mentioned, we do have some time here to hear feedback from you guys and adjust this product to what you think is right for the area. And, one thing I want to mention too, when it comes to the overlay zones that we just talked about, those have a recommended geographic boundary that aligns with things like higher levels of coastal flood risk or the existing flood zones now. And so keep in mind that you can discuss not just the tools that we use, but where specifically they should go within the study area, because we do want to be surgical with this approach. So that being said, here's our timeline that we're looking at. We're looking at an upcoming community meeting in late October. And I do want to defer to the council people, working closely on this study. I know you're going to want to do some planning with us on that. And then we're anticipating that this would go to Planning and Zoning Commission in November and then Council in December. That being said, you have time to discuss and amend those timelines as you see fit. And so we're all the way through all of our slides. So you guys, I know you have questions. Jump on in.
Okay, yes, we do have quite a few members. Thanks for your patience. Mr. Kugel?
Thank you. And a great presentation, very easy to understand. So I recently had, I discovered several months ago in my district near Brown Switch and Military Road, there's around 77 to 80 acres that was previously designated as a PUD 20 years ago when there was a thought to do a development there, and apparently around 151 homes. So I decided to try to get it rezoned to R1. I think I had said A1D, but this is now the new UDC. And there was a lot of concern because there's a lot of flooding near there that this meant that there's a development coming. And I explained, no, I'm just fixing something because I don't want a problem in the future. But one of the things that had been requested is can't you zone it instead to wetlands? And my understanding is there's not a zoning for wetlands. I have to zone it to something.
Right.
And there's not like and again, of course, people have property rights. So it's ultimately being zoned to R1. But in those particular cases, if you are concerned that development is going to cause flooding to the surrounding existing area, what are and I know you sort of went through this a little bit. What is your recommendation?
That's a great question. Yeah, what a good example of all the concepts. Absolutely. I mean, we do have a couple zoning classifications in the UDC that are very low density or low intensity, or are, for example, the public facilities classification. So you saw on the map, a lot of the wetlands in this area are already PF1 or PF2, exactly. And so I would put to you that, you want to be cautious with that, of course. Like you're saying, you don't want to over prescribe a zoning district that is really meant for natural resources. At the same time, it doesn't mean people can't use their property. It just means that they can't build very dense on it. So there definitely are options in the zoning code.
Moving on, we have Mr. Corbin.
Over here.
I'm like,
Blonde. A couple questions. You started out right on chart 5 of saying that the flood maps are out of date. I would assume that this whole study is predicated on flood maps based on the way that you teed that up. How do those two things play together, and why are they not accurate and up to date?
right. I know there are probably other people also that have a lot of opinions on this, so I don't want to steal the floor on answering that. Now, I'm pulling this from memory again, but I think when I checked, our flood maps here are from the effective flood maps, which is different from like any study out there.
Yep.
Right, are from '89. Now, there are lots of engineering studies and preliminary flood maps that are much more recent than that, although some of them still rely on older data. So even the publication date of a study can be a little confusing, even if it is pulling from many decades ago surveying data of the actual topography. So that being said, I know there are probably others that want to jump in on this question. There is a lot of flood data out there. We've looked at all the various sources. There's not just engineering studies and firms from FEMA, which is what we call our flood maps. There's also things like CPRA issues a lot of data that has to do specifically with coastal flooding. So of course we've looked at all of that, but this study is not tied to the adoption of any specific flood map. It's just using that data.
Well, but if your recommendations are based on a flood map as the anchor point from 1989, how relevant is that?
That's a valid point. I would put to you there is a technical difference and a regulatory difference in what you adopt as your flood map for the basis of your NFIP program, your National Flood Insurance Program. That flood map has a ton of regulatory implications for people. So you do want to be very careful about what you adopt as your regulatory firm versus what you use to inform other decisions, right? There's a ton of science out there. You don't adopt every single study as your flood map because it's regulatory. It becomes the law.
Okay, and the last question I had, and just to make a couple notes, is on page 6, your chart, you talked about drainage capacity. Is the implication of your statement of the draining limitations are influenced by natural flooding patterns, high tide and storm surges impede? Is there an implication that we should be considering at some point in time mechanical components to go assist our drainage
That's a good
versus
point.
just using gravity as the primary draining mechanism? Is that what you're implying?
Well, so I know we do have a pretty complex drainage system, and I know there are engineers here with much more kind of hands-on knowledge of operating that system. So that's a pretty big question that I want to allow them to answer if they want to, of whether or not, the whole system would need more engineered components. I know there are, some big master planning pieces that you want to think through. It's not something you can just quickly say yes or no. It actually is a very complicated answer.
My district has more coastline than any other district, so
Right.
I'm very familiar with what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
It's not super simple.
Mr. Hill, do you want to comment a little bit further on this?
While he's coming up, thank you very much.
Thank you guys for your questions. Great questions.
So the quick answer on adoption of the new FEMA maps, just so you know, we had reached out to FEMA, I believe it was sometime in July, and they stated that we should have preliminary maps ready for review again sometime mid next year. So that would put an adoption of new maps 26, 27 is what you would think. So I say when we look through thing on the parishes end, our critical drainage area ordinance and the way that establishes things, it includes anything within that has been designated 100-year floodplain. So when that ordinance was adopted, from a fill protection standpoint in our own ordinance, we're protecting those areas that haven't been adopted by FEMA in our ordinance. So we're safe there. I guess the concern gets sometimes is technically somebody's in an effective map. They don't have to elevate above a base flood elevation because there's really not one that's acknowledged by FEMA at that location, and they're not building high enough. Those sort of concerns still exist. But yeah, I think we kind of, since we were stuck in limbo, the parish made adjustments with the critical drainage area ordinance, and we're still protecting against it with that. But 26, 27 on adoption.
Thank you, sir. Councilman Laughlin?
So, thank you, Chairman. I really appreciate y'all's study. Y'all did some excellent work. Kudos to y'all. And the most important thing is you're helping me kind of figure out how do I implement a land use policy, or what we do for zoning. Because, I mean, there's a TND in that area. I think there's 3 of them in that area that, I mean, I don't understand why would anybody put that type of development in that area right now. And then to answer to comment on Councilman Corbin's thing, because y'all are just limited to land use only. So are y'all using the flood data, but our flood data is 35 years old. So I remember in conversation with other councilmen, I'm like, hey, how did that subdivision come? Well, that was approved 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, things were different. So if your flood maps are 35 years old, and you say, and as a, like, let's say I'm a contractor and I'm like, look, I'm trying to pull a permit to build a house here. And if it's not in a flood zone, I can build it on the ground. But that bet I'm making is on the future of that property. Not, it might not flood tomorrow after it's built, but it's going to flood because the data's old. It's 35 years ago, and that was before this neighborhood was built, and this neighborhood was built, and that neighborhood was built. And look, I'm a realtor, so I like to sell houses, but at the same time, I don't want to trap people in poverty. I don't want to sell someone a house that we approve, and they perceive that, well, the parish said it was okay, and they put their stamp of approval on it. Now, my house is underwater. So that's but I really do appreciate it. And just so I understand, y'all's recommendation, just kind of the preliminary one, the RS1 would be the more severe overlay?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
So we have 2 potential resilience overlay districts. It's the Res 1 and Res 2. Res 1 is more aggressively counteracting that coastal flood risk. They both deal with flood risk.
And,
that one more
and this
so.
might be a question more for Alex. How do we, or for Ross, how do we, if we put this overlay, is this something someone's going to be able to appeal later? Like, because, I mean, that's kind of the situation we get. Hey, I bought this piece of property. I got it cheap because it's not zoned the way I like it. Can I come undo it? And that seems to be like the things we deal with on a regular basis.
Right. So I think with these zoning districts, this overlay, you wouldn't necessarily have it be applied. Like, people are not necessarily going to ask for this, right? We're going to recommend that y'all adopt it as part of the study. One of the deliverables is the map and the ordinance with these proposed changes in it. And so if you had an appeal, it would be treated like any other zoning or text amendment. It would go to your BOA or the next step. It is appealable, just like any decision. But ultimately, it's not like a one-off. You're going to see these 1,000 times because you're getting, when we get PUD appeals or other small rezoning changes. I will say, just to add to the earlier question about the flood zones, because I do think it's important to clarify, even with an updated map, those are looking back. All of FEMA's maps look backwards. They don't look at future flood risk. And so it's important to know that this study is not just based on FEMA firms, old or new, and it wouldn't be good to wait to do something like this until you got new maps. I just don't want anybody to think, well, why don't we wait 2 more years until our maps are updated? Because those maps are just one way of looking at flood risk, and it's the way FEMA looks at flood risk, which we all know is there's a lot of room for improvement. Right? And so just keep in mind this study, when y'all are receiving the draft report, we're looking at core studies. We're looking at where you have concentrations of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. We're looking at the coastal zone, CPRAs, future projections of risk, and we're using all of those criteria together in addition to your flood map and your topography, right? So we are also looking at how the flood map reacts to your actual slope flatness, where you have different changes in elevations. And so all of that is being taken into account in addition to your residents telling us where they're flooding and where they are worried, right? So that also has come into play into where these areas may or may not be mapped, where they should be, you have a higher standard for development or a lower density that's being recommended. And so I think that was an important, I just don't want y'all to think we're using old maps to justify these recommendations. We are not. That is one thing. We know how limited that data set is. And And then just also keep in mind, we know flood risk is not fought only by land use recommendations. And so in the report, we also categorize and list all of the projects in Districts 11 and 7 that are working in conjunction with these land use regulations. Because if there's something planned that can reduce risk, we don't want to recommend higher standards and then have 1 year later a project change the flood risk profile and then make this more difficult to develop in an area that no longer is at risk. So when you do get the report, you're going to see those drainage projects that are in the capital improvement plan. And we've been working with Daniel, working with the Corps. And so there's lots of really good information if you're interested in this area and what is happening or what is planned to happen, not just related to land use, but also in the infrastructure space. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And special thanks to Ross for connecting us to Desireline.
We have a comment from legal.
Yeah, just going back to Arthur's initial question about what to do about those planned corridor overlays or the overlay in this instance. Currently, if we do have a property in an overlay district, the Planning Commission can grant waivers over certain requirements depending on the property standards. So there are mechanisms in the code to deal with that.
Okay, Mr. Impastato.
So great work and even better timing. Thank you, Ross, for getting District 7 involved in this and helping us. So the RS1 and RS2 will replace our existing critical drainage areas?
Oh, great question. No, they would not actually. So I'm so glad you brought that up. I probably should have mentioned that in the presentation. No, so we do have critical drainage areas and we have areas of special concern that are already mapped by engineering. Those are engineering tools, right, that have very specific criteria for where they're going to be mapped. These overlays mirror some of the standards that are in those engineering tools. So for some people, they're already dealing with some of these requirements, which is actually probably a good thing because you're not, adding a lot of additional restrictions to someone. They're pretty much steady state, right? But what we're proposing is that these would be overlay zones. So they would actually be a zoning tool rather than an engineering department tool, which gives you, very clear procedures for how they would be applied and how they would be waived. But it also gives you the ability to keep up with if you do have a major map change, if you do see a new pocket of rep loss properties emerging, you can use a zoning tool because it can be tied to a few different factors, right? And so it's a little bit more, I would say, like administratively and procedurally clear, from a zoning perspective. You can say, okay, you're in this zone because of reason A through C, right? And so that's what gives you the advantage. And to Councilman Laughlin's point, I really like that you're bringing up that it is a level of protection for a potential land buyer or home buyer, right? So that is also the goal of these tools, right? So that's why they're kind of in like the zoning wheelhouse versus the engineering wheelhouse.
And also, is there value so you build the elevated home and then you don't want any blockage, right? You would want the water to be able to flow freely on a storm event. Is there value to that?
You would want it to flow freely under the structure, yes. So the kind of, best case scenario from just a simple, drainage and floodplain management perspective is an elevated foundation, piers or pilings with as few obstructions under the house as possible, because the more dirt you have, the more pavement you have, and sometimes, people are putting like expensive equipment under there.
Right.
Right. Then all of that gets damaged and also it becomes debris and can hit someone else's house. So ideally you want the water to go there and not, pile up on equipment and dirt and everything else.
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Phillips?
Hi. You were touching on basically what I was going to ask, the definitions and the terminology you're using. Like, for example, the area I represent, we have a lot of drainage moratoriums in effect. And there's been the one area, a large study was done by engineering. So are your definitions matching up with them? For example, you use the term area of special concern and things of that nature, but I'm sort of getting an idea that your overlay sort of has a different definition, like our whatever.
That's correct. Yeah.
So now when that gets used, if it goes in front of the Planning and Zoning Committee, like, are they formal terms that they're allowed to base things on, you know, their decisions?
Yes. So overlay zones are different than the critical drainage areas for sure. And we're not proposing eliminating the critical drainage areas or swapping them out for this. This is just an additional tool in your toolbox. Like I said, some of the standards are relatively similar, right? In some of those areas of special concern, you have some fill limitations that would also translate into this overlay zone. But the overlay zone is also focused on building design, right? Things like the freeboard, the open foundation style, right? Storage of materials. Those are things that are not covered by a critical drainage area or area of special concern.
Okay, and then, like you were just mentioning that you think it would be best the water was free flowing. Now, that down by the coast, I could probably see that more in line, but I've had a conversation like with our engineering and a couple other people. Like, you have area of special concern and no fill area, but somebody wanted to build on a slab that just under the house there, if the drainage would support it, you could use like raise it to 2 feet or whatever above the center of the street. Now, you wouldn't have free flow water going, but you're thinking it would be too much fill from that to do that.
Well, it depends on the area. And so that's why we want to be surgical with where you apply these overlay zones. Because like you're saying, if it's an area that can drain even with additional building footprint, right, that does take up water storage area, if you can still maintain drainage, you don't want to prohibit that for somebody. You want to target it to the areas where you really do need the water to, wash in and wash out, or to be able to drain quickly through those areas. A lot of the coastal areas, they're at a high level of flood risk. So you really don't want to take away any area for the water to be, or it'll get higher.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Laughlin?
Yeah, I have 2 things to say.
Oh, my apologies.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, I have 2 things to say. Number one, I feel like we need to build like our great-grandparents did. So if you've been to my district and you go down Bayou Liberty Road, right next to my church at St. Genevieve is a old Creole cottage across the street that's been there for like 150 years old. It's 3 feet off the ground, and it doesn't need to be elevated. And it worked then because they didn't ignore the water. I feel like some time ago, no offense to my engineers, but somebody said, I got the technology. I can build a slab. We can build on a slab, and you don't have to walk 3 steps. Because a lot of people, look, as a realtor, I can tell you, they hate walking up 3 steps to get into their house. But to go back to what y'all are saying, if we were just going to use it just in 11, all right, and I did RS1 south of 190 and RS2 between 12 and, would that be something we could do? Like, would that be a good recommendation? Because below 190 or south of 190 is the more severe risk. And then between 90 and 190 and I-12 is still a risk, but it's not as bad. But we're still having your, like, that's something we could use. I could just cover the whole area with your overlay, and then planning and zoning and purchasers and things would have to take that into consideration when they're going to buy that piece of property. Would that be y'all's recommendation? Like,
That's a possible way to do it.
Yeah.
Well, I wanna, because where you're at, it makes sense. Sorry, I'm just gonna.
Go on in. We're thinking the same.
Because I don't want to, because we know we work really closely with the builders, right? And so I don't want them to freak out. I think the key here is we're looking at this with a scalpel, like we are. What you're saying is not wrong. But you're describing it generally. And so there are ridges in this region that are a little higher, and like I think Councilman Phillips, you were asking the right questions about, are these the same with the critical drainage areas and the areas of special concern? These are 3 tools that deal with 3 different unique flood risk scenarios, and they are like surgical in their application, because we recognize that we don't want to put a burden of a higher standard where it's not necessary. And because it's so flat and there are these ridges in the region, there are areas where the overlay zone is going to be perfect, right? And there are areas where the critical drainage areas work and where and these other areas work. And then we might see some of these be replaced and refined over time because they're better defined as a result of this process, right? And so I think that the question of definition and purpose is key. And to your point, Arthur, we're looking at the whole thing, but we're also looking at the ridges and the topography and saying, well, in this area, you could potentially build on a slab. There's like a couple sites south of I-12 where you could put it on a slab.
You could give me a prototype map to use
Yes.
for my district, and I can use
We
that as my
have it.
guide. And that's how I'm
Bringing
going
it to the community
paint
meeting.
the zoning area.
Exactly, and that's the key. Is like so the new districts in the UDC we are recommending those as part of this study, and so you'll see those densities fluctuate, and they are very one-to-one based on the different levels of flood risk that are experienced all throughout District 7 and 11.
Thank y'all.
Great.
Okay, Mr. Phillips.
Yeah, can you come back up?
I can come back up.
I liked what you said about the surgical approach
Yeah.
to this because, for example, right around here, up north, a couple streets, it basically seems to be like an area to do that. I have people calling me, they have
Right.
somewhat dense lots, but then another guy might have an acre lot, and it would be okay to bring in, and for him to build a house on an acre and put fill under the slab and it not cause any problem, but now you have to tell the person down the street, well, your density's too high.
Right, down the street might be different. Like that's the
Exactly.
crazy part is that in Louisiana, we're so flat. When we talk about fill, some people are very pro-fill and some people are very no-fill. But the reality is it just depends on where you are, right? If you move a little dirt and you are totally flat, it does have an effect on your neighbors, just a little bit. It's like building a garden and like the back of your backyard floods and you're like, what did I do? I just planted a garden. It's like that's all it takes in some areas.
So now we get back to, we have a moratorium, or I have a couple of them, and I got it, I keep renewing these things because I'm worried about the flooding. They bring me pictures, they show me, I go up there, I walk in it and
Right.
everything like that. And then
You know
I
it
guess,
floods.
right. and
Right,
then I
y'all know it floods.
Now I get to the legal aspect, I mean, we got guys that want to build, people are not working because they can't build there, they have their property they want to do with it, so.
Right, in a lot of those instances, the builder's like, just tell me what I need to do,
Right.
and I will jump through those hoops, but I just need to know what it is the standard. And so this, the proposed overlay is really meant to facilitate that next step without the need of an engineering
So
study.
you're talking about changes to the UDC then, right?
That's right, as it would be
Okay.
a new overlay. And I think this is where, I want to just make sure y'all know we were very cognizant that we didn't want to make your code more complex. Believe it or not, we tried to see if there was a way to replace the critical drainage areas or the areas of special concern with the overlay to see if there was some streamlining opportunities. But the more we worked with engineering, the more we realized, no, these really do offer different solutions for different scenarios. And I think that's much more defensible for y'all, who are anticipating appeals, when you can say we had 3 options, we picked the right one versus we had one option and we just applied it everywhere, regardless of your local conditions. We want to be able to put y'all in the best defensible position possible that protects future residents in the parish and existing. Yeah, well,
It's tricky. It's tricky.
aim for the moon.
Okay, we have one more. Mr. Impostado.
Just real quick. So I'm glad you said surgical because I know we have areas in Lacombe or District 7 south of 190 that have ridges, right? And they're
Yeah.
higher, and even
We're
along the
intimately
bayou.
aware of your risks.
But some instances where you may, a property may be on a ridge or in a higher area, and then a block away it drops so fast.
Yep.
And they would be in an area that's critical
Yeah.
drainage and has major issues.
The overlay would snap to the parcel. That's the key. To the parcel.
But it would still be detrimental for that person to add fill, right? Because potentially they could harm their neighbor. So do we have to take that into consideration as well?
I think these things, I think that if you're high and you're dry and you don't have the likelihood of flooding your neighbor if you have limited fill, I think we can say a little bit of dirt under your slab for the most part is okay. And Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong.
On like a low density lot.
In a low density lot, because the lots
Right.
are big, right? So it's like that water has to travel all the way across your lot before it even touches another property, right? And so that it's a combination of these tools that will work to reduce flood risk.
So one street could have RS1 and RS2 on it potentially, which makes sense. Thank you.
Great question.
And some of them, just to add on to that, like, so the RS1 that we were talking about, the kind of more cautious approach that is really to counteract that high risk flooding, that's in areas where CPRA has told us we're likely to see 4 feet of water above the ground in those areas. So it's really responding to a documented, risk that is imminent. So you don't want to do it for no reason. You got to have the science.
Okay, Mr. Phillips.
Last question. When you talk about limited fill, how do you police that? Do you have a vision on that?
Oh, we'd have to
Because
get
like
with
if you
Kenny.
do it initially and you walk away from the project,
Yeah.
what's to stop the homeowner from, hey, nobody's watching, I'm just going to start bringing in fill?
Yeah, exactly. Code enforcement and our next step, we wanted to update y'all with, what's on our minds right now, what we're thinking the recommendations could look like. And our next step is to roll up our sleeves with parish staff. So these are great questions for us to needle into with parish staff to say, what are you thinking are going to be the problems with implementation? What can we do to support troubleshooting in advance? And if possible, if it's going to be hard or impossible to police, we don't want to put that on y'all, right? We don't want to propose a recommendation that's impossible to manage. So we'll be working with that.
Surprised, though, fill is actually one of the easier things.
'Cause you can see it.
Because their neighbors call.
They call.
People get really mad.
Y'all know.
If someone puts
They
dirt
call.
next to their house.
Thank y'all. And keep in mind that this is not the last opportunity to talk about this with us. We're going to continue to work on this over the next couple months. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to come to the community meeting at the end of October, because then you can hear, how residents and locals are thinking about this as well.
All righty. Thank you for the presentation. We appreciate it, and we look forward to that community meeting. Okay, so that being said, I think I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Have a good meeting. Have a good next meeting, the financial meeting. Thank you.